Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of ancient warfare related ranting and raving and musing by me, generally in response to someone's question about something that perplexes them on ancient warfare. What I do here indeed is that I answer questions. You can ask a question, you can send an email, a postcard, you can comment on a previous video podcast. They will wind their way to me somehow. And, of course, you can back us on Patreon, one of three different levels, Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Now, today's question's kind of three, and I believe I've already answered a question from this person without actually bringing up who they are or their prefaces. So I'm going to go through all their prefaces. So apologies. So the question comes from Peter Carr. Hi, Peter. I've already answered a question, if not two, of yours without reading all of these. So there's three different entries that he's got. So he's clearly keen on an answer on this particular question about the Battle of Arausio in 105 BC between the Cimbri and the Teutones against the Roman army on the Rhone at Arausio, which is now Orange, or Orange. No, I'm not sure. Orange, of course, is a town in Australia called Orange. Anyway, I digress. So Peter says, thank you for your fantastic podcast. My pleasure. I drive 2 hours each way for work, and they make that trip that much shorter. I have been a long-time subscriber to the physical magazine. Thank you again. Second, recently I have been discussing the battle of Arausio in 105 BC with a wargaming buddy. There are some interesting questions that I'd be interested in your opinions on. Next entry. Was Arausio a failure of Roman arms or a failure of Roman politics that just happened to end in a massacre? Also, if Caepio and Mallius had cooperated, was Arausio still unwinnable? How competent were the Cimbrian commanders? Are we underestimating them because our sources are Roman? Cheers. All right. Well, if any of you have attempted to research the Battle of Arausio, you will know that our sources for it are particularly poor, particularly widespread, and what you tend to get is Arausio is a disaster, it's a disaster, it's a disaster, and they then move on immediately to Marius, who is appointed consul in absentia and then successively several years in a row in order to deal with the problem, which he does at the battles of AWA402 and Vercellae in 102 and 101 BC. So they kind of gloss over the defeat of Arausio because victory comes. Now, of course, at the time, that wouldn't have been happening. It was an unmitigated disaster. Sallust and Velleius Paterculus talk about how fearful Rome was that they were about to be invaded by these tribes. There's a really interesting issue that happens in these sources that, the Cimbri and the Teutones are Germanic tribes from the Jutland Peninsula. We think they start migrating south around 115 BC. And they sort of meander all over the place. Their first contact with Rome is in 113. They defeat the Romans at the Battle of Noraea in Noricum. Then they wander through Gaul. They defeat several more Roman armies in 109, 107, which our sources on are even worse than they are on the Battle of Arausio. What we know is that they defeat consuls and consular armies. So in total, the Cimbri and the Teutones defeat 5 consular armies. So pretty drastic problem. The interesting thing is that several of our sources call them Gallic or Celtic tribes, which is a mistake, but it revives the fear in Rome of the Gallic-Celtic invasion of 390 BC in the Battle of the Allia, which is connected to Arausio, which I'll get to. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that our sources on the actual military maneuvers of the battle are almost non-existent. We don't find out about that. In fact, this entire age, even though this is the age of the Marian reforms, for those of you listening, I'm doing that in inverted commas, the current opinion on the Marian reforms is they're not actually attributable to Marius. They're not actually even a program of reforms, which is a single program of reforms. They are a process of reforms which begin before Marius and don't end until the time of Julius Caesar. That's the current opinion on that. And in all of that, one person who does seem to have imposed some emergency reforms is Rutilius Rufus, who's a friend of Marius's. He's a consul in 105 BC. He's not at the Battle of Arausio, which we'll get to. and he writes a history. He also reforms the Roman army, and I'll get to those too. So he does seem to have reformed the Roman army in the immediate aftermath of the defeat at Arausio. Not Marius, but he's not credited with these reforms except in Valerius Maximus. No one trusts Valerius Maximus. Anyway, what you've got is the Cimbri and the Teutones move around, they split. So what we find is the Teutones go into Normandy, and the Cimbri, meanwhile, go into Hispania, where they're defeated, and they come back, they rejoin with the Teutones, then they come down to the Rhone River, which is where they encounter Caepio and Mallius in 105 BC. You know, Italy is open after the Battle of Arausio in 105, but they don't come into Italy. They seem to be defeated by the Helvetii, and they stay away, and of course Marius is then appointed to deal with them, which he does in 102 and 101. What you've got, however, is this idea that it's not Roman arms that are inferior, it's the infighting and the incompetence of Roman commanders. And so nearly all of our sources about the Battle of Arausio and the lead up to it, and even the aftermath of it, are about the fact that you have aristocratic and new men fighting, and it's the perfect example of that. Normally Marius, being a new man and being so incredibly skilled as a commander, as opposed to people like Metellus or Sulla and others being aristocratic and skilled commanders, they're contrasted against one another. At the time, in 105 and onwards, for the next 5-6 years, Marius is regarded as the only man who can save Rome. He's the only competent general that they've got. And so what you've got in Arausio is a sort of the perfect example of this incompetence. So, what you've got is, in those maneuverings of the Cimbri and the Teutones, the Roman ally in the province of, now it's not Gallia Narbonensis, that's the other province. What you've got is another province which disappears very soon, Gallia Transalpina. So you've got Gallia Transalpina and Gallia Narbonensis. And what you've got is, when they move through near Toulouse, or Tolosa as it was in the ancient world, the people of Tolosa rebel against their Roman alliance and they side with the Cimbri. So in 106 BC, Quintus Servilius Caepio is dispatched to retake Tolosa and bring it back to its loyalty, which he does successfully. More of that in a moment, put that to one side. He's therefore appointed as a proconsul. He's there with a proconsular army. In 105 BC, the Cimbri and the Teutones who've joined up, they come back towards Roman territory and the Rhone, and the consul, whose name is Gnaeus Mallius Maximus, he's dispatched. Now, as I said before, his co-consul is Rutilius Rufus. Now, Rutilius Rufus is an experienced commander, and Gnaeus Mallius Maximus is not an experienced commander. Like Marius, he's a novus homo. He's a new man. He's not a patrician. One of the questions about the Battle of Arausio is, why would you have an experienced commander in Rufus giving the command of a consular army to an inexperienced commander and dispatching him to fight this threat of the Cimbri, who've already defeated 3 Roman armies? We don't know. What happens, however, is that when Mallius arrives, and he's got competent commanders. One of his commanders is a Scaurus, who's already been a consul in 108, Marcus Aurelius Scaurus. He's commanding Mallius's cavalry. So he's got competent commanders with him. Problem is that when he arrives, Caepio refuses to coordinate with him, refuses to join armies and face the Cimbri with a combined double consular army. That's the main problem as highlighted in the sources. What seems to happen is Mallius sends Scaurus away, possibly to reconnoitre. One of the fascinating sources of this is a guy called Granius Licinius, who wrote an Annales in the 2nd century, which is a source for this period only. It's very fragmentary, but he does give us some detail. What he says is that the cavalry dispatched 30 Roman miles away, so that's 44 kilometres away, That's a long way to reconnoitre. That's 2 days' ride, roughly, to get back. Scaurus is attacked by the Cimbri. He's unhorsed. He's taken captive, and he's then put to death by the chieftain of the Cimbri, a man whose name is Boiorix. Sounds like Asterix and Obelix. Boiorix. And so he's called a chieftain. Later he gets called a king by various different sources. So Boiorix is one of the commanders of the Cimbri. The Teutones are commanded, we're told later, by their king. What happens is, with that defeat and that execution, probably the Cimbri embassies are sent to Mallius at that point. Mallius requests again that Caepio comes and helps him. Caepio refuses. Now, this is where it starts to get slightly confused in the sources, because we're not sure what the course of events is. Possibly, having defeated the cavalry, they then come and they defeat Mallius. Caepio then crosses the Rhone. There is no bridge. Crosses the Rhone and faces the Cimbri alone and is defeated. And so you've actually got a huge piecemeal defeat of these Roman armies. More probably, what happens is Mallius requests Caepio assist him. Caepio refuses. Mallius camps against the oncoming Cimbri himself. Before they reach him, Caepio does cross the Rhone. He then chooses not to combine his army with Mallius, but he camps separately, but he camps further forward so that he is between the Cimbri and Mallius, and therefore he will fight the Cimbri by himself, of course, hubristically thinking he will win and defeat the Cimbri by himself, and therefore he will get all the glory. What happens, however, is the Cimbri defeat him. He flees. According to one of our sources, only 10 men survive, including the quaestor Quintus Sertorius, who swims across the Rhone. The army of the Cimbri then come on and they defeat Mallius as well. And so, again, what you've had is the cavalry are defeated, Caepio's defeated, Mallius is defeated piecemeal. And so it's an utter disaster. One version of the sources is that Rome loses 120,000 men, 80,000 legionaries, and 40,000 auxiliaries. The numbers are a bit weird because one source, Rutilius Rufus's history, says that it's 70,000 Roman legionaries and allied troops, so auxiliaries and allies. And then Livy says, following Valerius Antias, that it's 80,000 and then 40,000 are killed in the camps. So it's 120,000 men. And that's why you'll find people saying that it's a worse defeat than the Battle of Cannae, where Polybius says 70,000, Livy says 50,000 men are lost. But this is worse than that, way worse than that. And so, again, we don't know how this defeat happens. We don't know how the battle actually pans out. We just know that it's a disaster and a great loss. We are told that, and this is by Plutarch talking about Marius, that the Cimbri, and he talks about the Cimbri, not the Cimbri and the Teutones, and there's two other tribes who get named, the Ambrones and the Tigurini. So it's possibly a combination of 4 tribes, but Plutarch says that the Cimbri had 300,000 warriors. Now, I don't think that's huge, because if you've then got 4 tribes, even though the Ambrones and the Tigurini are smaller, you're doubling that number with the Teutones, which is crazy. Huge number. Anyway, what you've got is they massively outnumber the Romans, even with a combined army. So even if that army of 80,000 up to 120,000 men fought the Cimbri and the Teutones, they're outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. So I don't know that even if they had have been combined, they would have won. Peculiarly, we get several side stories which sort of distract from that. The first one is that the defeat of the Battle of Arausio occurs on October the 6th. It's one of the very few bang-on solid dates. Granius tells us that it's the day before the nones of October. The nones of October is the 7th, so it's October the 6th. It's a black day, a dies nefasti in the Roman calendar. And there's only a few days. And weirdly, even though they're black days, we actually don't know the actual day on several of the others. So the black days in the Roman calendar where you were not allowed to conduct any business the Battle of the Allia, which is July 18th. The Battle of the Caudine Forks, we don't know the actual day. The Battle of Cannae, we don't know the actual day. And the Varian disaster, later, we don't know the actual day. We think that Cannae was around September the 9th, but October the 6th, weirdly, is the one that we have a great amount of information on, because you get several different things happening on that day. So, for instance, when Lucullus was set to fight Tigranes at the Battle of Tigranocerta in the Third Mithridatic War in 69 BC, he's reminded that the October the 6th is a black day and he shouldn't fight. He says, no, I'm going to fight. I'm going to change it into a lucky day. So he does, and he wins, which is interesting. However, later, and this is much later, this is in AD 468. So this is, 500, more than 500 years later, we get the reminding of the October the 6th Black Day in a panegyric on Anthemius, talking about how, that day nothing happened in 468 because of what had happened in 105 BC. Craziness. Anyway, Vitellius famously got into trouble, especially with Tacitus, for forgetting that July the 18th was a black day and trying to conduct some business as Pontifex Maximus on the black day of July 18th, the anniversary of the defeat of the Allia. Anyway, black days, that's a very cool subsection on the Battle of Arausio. Another one is, I said, these reforms that are normally credited to Marius. The two major ones, the idea of relaxing wealth qualifications for military service and paying men, and the creation of the self-sufficient Marian mule. There's other reforms, such as the wooden peg in the pilum, which some people say is earlier and or later, as are these other reforms, whether the wealth qualification has actually been relaxed for quite some time and paying has occurred for quite some time. However, what we do find is that Rutilius Rufus is given some credit by Valerius Maximus and Frontinus of actually implementing some reforms. The first one, and Granius Licinius also says, first one is that he bans under 25s from leaving Italy, including his own son. So, it applies to everybody, and that they must swear an oath that they will stay and defend their homeland. That's the first one. The second one is that Valerius Maximus tells us that after Arausio, Rutilius calls together the teachers of the gladiators from the school of Caius Aurelius Scaurus, relation of Marcus Aurelius Scaurus, who dies, and he was the first to make the legions learn more skillful ways of avoiding and giving blows. Now, here we can go back to an earlier answer I gave about gladiators in the Roman military, where I was talking about not knowing whether there's a superiority. Here there's an interesting, and again, it's a crisis, where the gladiators' techniques are passed on to the Roman soldiers as a sort of an emergency measure to make them better at evading blows and better at giving blows, which is really interesting. And proof of the effectiveness of Rutilius's reforms is really interesting in the sense that Frontinus records that when in 104, Marius is now the consul, he has the option of choosing the army that he had just led to victory against Bocchus and Jugurtha in Numidia, or taking the army that Rutilius had reformed the year before. He chooses Rutilius's army because they are of more trustier discipline, which tells you something about Rutilius's reforms and how effective they are, and why we don't really hear about anything in 105, 104, 103. We only hear about Marius winning in 102. Okay, so I know I've gone on longer than 10 minutes. It's actually the 2nd of January, so Happy New Year. This will come out much, much later because I record them all in advance. But of course, a special New Year's present. So, was it a failure of Roman arms? Yes, but we don't know the specifics of why the reforms that are credited to Marius and that Rutilius engages in do seem to be addressing a problem. However, there are Roman armies, such as Marius's in Numidia, which are achieving success at this point in time, not to mention the Cimbrian, the Teutones, are being defeated by the Celtiberians in Hispania and the Helvetii. So it's not just Roman arms. It could be numbers. Or a failure of Roman politics. It's very much a failure of Roman politics and the jealousies and lack of willing to work together between patricians and new men. There's also some incompetence there. And, If Caepio and Mallius had cooperated, was Arausio still unwinnable? Hard to know. Marius, of course, does defeat them, but he does defeat them separately thereafter. Possibly it was still unwinnable. If it's a combined number of the tribes, it's possibly unwinnable, even with a combined army. They may still outnumber the Roman army combined as by 2 to 1. How competent were the Cimbrian commanders? Are we underestimating them because of our sources? Again, one of the things, I think I've spoken about it before in Roman sources especially, that Romans lose battles. Barbarian enemies don't win them. And so the way that Romans talk about losses is that we lost. The expectation is we should win, not that they get outmaneuvered and outgeneraled. Probably the exception is Hannibal, but there's lots of examples of enemy commanders, Decebalus, Fritigern at the Battle of Adrianople and things. They aren't credited with any winning strategy. It's that the Romans lost, not that they got defeated or beaten by a better general. And that, I think, is what's coming. Because we have no details at Arausio, it's hard to know if there was any strategy or tactic. However, the competence of the Cimbri and the Teutones to defeat the cavalry by themselves, to defeat Mallius's army by itself, to defeat Caepio's army by itself other way around, Caepio's army, Mallius's army, very much competent generalship. Don't wait for your enemy to combine. When you see that they are not combining, attack them and defeat them piecemeal. There's something in the sources, I think it's Dio Cassius, that talks about the fact that when Caepio crosses the Rhone, the disagreements and the fractures within the Roman army are invisible to the Cimbri. They haven't seen that yet. But they would quite easily have seen that there were separate camps and that therefore attacking Caepio independently is the best idea. And that is indeed what they do. So failure of Roman arms, yes and no. Failure of Roman politics, absolutely. If they'd cooperated, was it unwinnable? Probably. How competent were the Cimbrian commanders? Quite competent. There you go. I hope that answers your question, Peter. And Happy New Year. And, I didn't even talk about the gold of Tolosa. Maybe that's another podcast. Join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.